This is Politics and the Exilic City with Nojang Hatami and Zain Mirab, a podcast about the experience of exile and in-betweenness, the possibilities of sustaining resistance in marginal spaces, and the politics of movement and migration. Today we have an episode with obviously just the two of us, and Nojang has brought some interesting material for us. So Nojang, why don't you tell us what we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, there's been some stuff floating around, mainly on the internet, and social media and YouTube videos that are getting a lot of views and that I think a lot of people are talking about. It started a lot of discussions, and they've been ongoing discussions, right? But I think in recent times, they're kind of blown up. And one in particular is some of the claims that people like Catherine Liu, who we're going to talk about in terms of her framing of identity politics, in particular with regard to race and gender, and the claims that she makes about class and the need to have what she claims to be a kind of committed socialism, but that I think there are a lot of problems, including the characterizations that she has of intellectuals and people in academia more broadly. So we're going to be diving into that and engaging with it at a deeper level as well, and not just kind of talking about it, in a superficial way. So we're going to devote most of the episode to that. But before we get underway with that, I know, Zain, you had your exilic moment that you were going to share with us.
Yeah, so I was thinking about it. It's a short one, this episode, but I was walking this past weekend to deposit the recycling. So in France, glass is separate. It's very strange. It's centralized, and you have to take it to these centralized locations. And so I was walking the glass to the recycling, and there was this little police minivan filled with these police officers, maybe military officers as well, or military soldiers in their uniforms. And one of them, sitting in the front seat in the passenger side, had a balaclava on his face, ice style. And it was really chilling to see that and to think that perhaps what he was doing was imitating ICE. And it just made me think about something that I've said a lot since moving to France, which is the police here, everything seems fine on the surface because there are guardrails in place and they're holding. But one bad election, and we know that France has a very fraught political scene and a far left that has constantly been mounting electoral challenges and gets a little bit closer every time, that these are the people who are going to transform from public safety to picking on immigrants and picking on Black people and picking on women and doing the things that we know that paramilitary forces do. And in some ways is the raison d'être, right? It's why they sign up in the first place, and they're held in check. And it was just, I felt like a really spectacular reminder of that potential that every police or military person carries with them in the social world.
Yeah, really disturbing. I don't know if, how unprecedented that is in the case of France. I mean, I hadn't heard about or seen, police in balaclavas. But again, in some of the ways that we have discussed before, these things are, of course, very closely connected to patterns that we're seeing here in the U.S. And it connects actually really well to what we want to talk about in today's episode, right? Because a lot of these sorts of patterns, I think, are dependent on these ways in which power continues to be entrenched and used against parts of the population, in many ways dependent on identity, right? So as you said, the attacks on Black people, on Muslims, on women, on transgender people, all of these things, of course, depend in one way or another on identity markers and this kind of weaponization against them. And so part of what I thought we might open up with, and I think we should also frame it for our listeners and our viewers to first know exactly who we're talking about and explain why we want to talk about somebody like Catherine Liu in particular. So for those who haven't seen, her videos or her writings, and especially, these kinds of appearances that she's had recently on certain online platforms, including like interviews and podcasts and things like this, there's been a trend, I think, with people like Catherine Liu of attacking people on the basis of their reliance or their use of the discourse of identity politics, right? So a lot of the videos that she has put out kind of frame identity politics in this way that is, again, according to her own terms. I'm going to actually read part of an excerpt from her book, but she frames it herself as being intentionally polemical. And she basically says that she wants to take aim at people who are, in her view, kind of leveraging their identity in some way and using the language of trauma and suffering and things like this in a way that ends up, according to her, undermining the real important commitments that we should have, which for her supposedly are
Right.
social.
I was going to say, let me guess, class struggle, which is not to minimize class struggle, but is to say that in my experience, the people who claim that those who they identify in the identity camp aren't paying sufficient attention to class seem to not hear the people in the identity camp who talk all the time about class. So it, to my mind, is a very unidirectional problem that's being named that I think just comes up time and time again. We could substitute her name with any number of figures, especially since the 2016 election, when people were saying, oh, we went too far on identity. We had a black president and look where that got us. So
Right.
yeah, I'm excited to see what you pulled together in particular with Catherine Liu. Can you intro like her position and where she's at and things like that for folks who might not know?
Yeah, of course. Funny enough, because part of the way that she presents herself is as being like very critical of other people who are in academia, but she herself also is in academia, right? So she's a professor of film and media studies in the School of Humanities at UCI, University of California, Irvine. And she's, of course, like been active and has written about these kinds of issues for a while, but it's most recently, like in the past few months, that she's, I think, just getting a lot more exposure. And I think a lot of people who somehow, again, identify with the left or taking a certain position on the left and claiming to take up like the mantle of class struggle, I think a lot of people have gravitated towards her. And also, I think it'll be interesting to talk about, what that group of people who are following these kinds of ideas kind of consists in, right? Because some of those people might also be connected in some ways to academia. Some, might be in some ways disillusioned with universities and the directions that things have been going in. But I think it's also a lot of people, it seems to me, who are just very skeptical of academia and of intellectuals in general. And I think she's really tapped into that, it seems,
Yeah.
right? Especially people who are skeptical about the whole sort of enterprise. But again, part of the irony is that she's very much a part of that kind of class or group of people that she claims to
This is
criticize.
always the case where the evidence used to say there is a problem is actually indicative of the person's situation and relation. But real quick, the other thing I want to know is, do you know what her position on Palestine is? I feel like that'll give us a lot of info.
That's a good question. Honestly, I have not seen her in the many clips that I've seen and in like her book, which I'm going to read some excerpts from Virtue Hoarders. But I don't recall her even mentioning
Which in and of
Palestine.
itself is a position.
Part of what I have seen,
That's a position to not mention it.
right,
So
right. I think, yeah, maybe, the things that, yeah, like you're saying, the things that she doesn't say maybe tell us a lot. But I think maybe kind of indirectly, some of the people that she takes aim at in her critiques of what she broadly frames as identity politics, she had some things to say, for example, about Edward Said and how he is part of the reason why we're in this kind of like dilemma now. So she says that she blames intellectuals like Said for having, talked about consciousness, about identity. And of course, as we know, one of his real commitments and goals in life was to raise awareness and consciousness about
Mm-hmm.
Palestine and the plight of Palestinians. And so that I think says at least a little bit about what her position is likely to be. But of course, we can, do more digging. And I also want to say, as we dive into this, like for our listeners, it'll be great to get engagement on this as well. So, for those who are tuning in, if anyone has come across other things that she may, not only her in particular, but kind of people in this kind of group, the positions that they take on Palestine, it'd be interesting to hear other perspectives as well. But the main thing that I thought we could focus on, and then we'll touch on these points as we go, is the framing itself that she provides, right? And so on the one hand, for Catherine Liu, the way that she has been presenting these attacks, again, this kind of polemical account that she gives of intellectuals, it's done in this, I think, intentionally provocative way that, of course, as we all know, has become very prevalent in recent years, which is to put up these kinds of YouTube videos that are kind of just like bait, right? They're kind of like clickbait. They're meant to get, a very large number of views. And so often, it'll have like provocative titles like "The End of Identity Politics" in all caps. And then it'll sometimes have like suggestive pictures. So I think, one of the videos that I shared with you, Zain, and that I thought, it'd be good to get more of your thoughts on, is that in these kinds of attacks that she has, which are not even really veiled attacks, I think they're pretty open on trans people. One of the images in the kind of thumbnail to one of the videos is to have like someone wearing an earring that says "they." And then she has stuff in her writings as well where she talks about, this new, what she calls like a trend in talking about pronouns and the ways that people want to use pronouns.
I think it's
Positions.
funny that
Yeah.
her book is called Virtue Hoarders because it sounds to me like she is a
Mm.
resentment hoarder. And that's how she
Mm.
is
Mm-hmm.
gaining
Right.
traction in the public sphere.
Right.
So, to your
Yeah.
earlier point, so many of these polemical accusations are also admissions in a way. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
signaling here's what I'm doing, but don't pay attention to what I'm doing, pay attention to what they're doing.
Right, exactly. While somehow trying to distance herself from people that, especially those on the far right, who use the same talking points, right? But saying like, "Oh, but I'm doing this from a different position."
Yeah.
So one of the things that she talks about in her book, and I think it's probably more productive to actually engage with these points rather than the more, I think, very shallow kinds of critiques and clickbait that you see in her videos. So let's actually talk about what she says in her book. So in Virtue Hoarders, she says she identifies and really takes aim at what she calls the professional managerial class, or the PMC. She says the members of the PMC have memories of a time when they were more progressive. And she tends to do this constant sort of back and forth between like what was happening in the 60s and beyond that, and then kind of like where we're at in the present moment. So she says people, members of the PMC, still believe themselves to be the heroes of history, fighting to defend innocent victims against their evil victimizers. But the working class is not a group they find worth saving because, by PMC standards, they do not behave properly. They are either disengaged politically or too angry to be civil. Liberal members of the credentialed classes love to use the word empower when they talk about people, but the use of that verb objectifies the recipients to their help while implying that the people have no access to power without them. So that's one point, right? So supposedly everybody in the so-called professional managerial
Mm-hmm.
class claims to be a kind of vanguard for sort of subsets of people, but somehow, according to her, they forget about or are detached from or have resentments toward the working class.
I'm just so curious
Um,
here to think about
yeah.
the racialized dimensions of what she's talking about. In this imaginary,
Mm-hmm.
what do the members of the PMC look like, and what does the working class
Mm-hmm.
look like, and to what extent does that
Right.
reflect reality? Because it feels like it's implied, especially with the discourse of they behave badly. These are,
Mm-hmm.
to my mind, racialized tropes of criminality, of lack of
Mm-hmm.
respectability, these different things. And so She's not
Yeah.
explicitly naming race, but she's
Hmm.
drawing on discourse that calls to mind racial tropes.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, a lot of the language that she uses just kind of dances around things without actually
Hmm.
naming it. And it kind of, I think, often comes across as kind of like dog whistling, which again, as we were saying, is not unlike what people on the right tend to
Hmm.
do. Although on the far right, they're actually often even much more explicit about it,
Hmm.
right? And they talk about it and they frame it in terms of all of these fears and anxieties that exist among white nationalists in
Hmm.
particular. But let me read one
Hmm.
more excerpt in connection to that, in which again she kind of tries to claim to distance herself from people on the right who make the same points, but then frames it as like, in a way, implying that, oh, maybe we should also be listening to people on the right because they might have a good point about what liberals and academics and elites like tend to do, and like let's not go that route, she wants to say. So again, framing it as kind of in part historical and then connecting it to the present, she says, as the fortunes of the PMC elites rose, the class insisted on its ability to do ordinary things in extraordinary, fundamentally superior, and more virtuous ways. As a class, the PMC was reading books, raising children, eating food, staying healthy, and having sex as the most culturally and affectively advanced people in human history.
What is going on
There'll be
here?
some things to say about that. Yeah, what the fuck are you
Such
talking about?
okay.
And that becomes the basis for her whole book, actually, right? Like if you look at the chapters, the actual like core of the book, each one is dedicated to each of those points.
It's like what there's a
So
chapter on
reading books,
eating,
raising children, eating
having
food,
sex.
having
Wow.
sex.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah. And that's how she levels her
That's
critique.
so interesting.
And then here's the part about how this relates to people on the right. She says, while the conservative critique of this new class, whether from Herman Kahn, William F. Buckley, Newt Gingrich, or David Brooks and Tucker Carlson, is pure media theater, its condemnation of liberalism's secret contempt for ordinary people rings true.
I don't
So,
think David Brooks is not the vanguard of ordinary people. Like, I think it's
mm.
so absurd, but okay. You
Yeah.
can just go along for that ride, I suppose.
And the claims about elitism, like who are the elites here? Who are the
Yeah.
people who are actually in
Hmm.
power, right? And I think you were getting at this before, so I think we can open it up. What is the
Yeah.
PMC according to her, right? So the whole professional managerial class is, for her, she makes a lot of reference to
Hmm.
universities in particular, right? So like people who are in academia, and then she kind of lumps in intellectuals more broadly, but it seems like her main aim is universities. And it really takes on this kind of anti intellectual
Hmm.
tone because if we really think about intellectuals, what their roles are, what their vocations are, and what people in academia actually do, like I think for anybody who knows how universities actually function, there are all kinds of different groups within them, right? Different roles, different kinds of jobs and titles. So, universities consist in, there are administrators, there are executives, there are people who are board of trustees. And a lot of times, if we're going to talk about ideological orientations, what people are actually committed to within colleges and
It's
universities,
making money.
yeah, right. Like for people who are actually like
Hmm.
administrators, right? So like people in those positions, those are their interests and they make that
Yeah.
very clear. And those of us who are in academia know this. But to lump in people who are actually teachers, researchers, right? So whether they are tenured or tenure track or non-tenure folk who are working within these universities, to claim that we all have the same interests or that we're all collectively part of the professional managerial class, like just misses so is just so
It
inaccurate,
lacks
right?
nuance.
Like completely lacks nuance and just any
Hmm.
identification, right? Of like this like broad brushstroke of like what everybody in the so-called PMC is supposed to be doing and what we're supposed to be interested in. And then not only that, of course, there are subfields and disciplines, within
Hmm.
universities, right? So people who are in certain departments And programs are going to have, again, very different points of view and ideological orientations than those in others. So it's kind of odd to be comparing people who are, for example, professors in an English department or philosophy department or political science or, anthropology, sociology, etc., to others who are in the natural sciences or who are in business or law or accounting
Or
and things
part of
like
the
this.
administration who are, vice president of whatever. We always get all those emails. One of the things that popped into my head
Yeah.
as you were describing this and thinking about where exactly we can locate Lou in terms of political ideology is I've been doing a lot of reading recently about pseudoscience. And, pseudoscience
Mm-hmm.
isn't fake science. Pseudoscience is a ideological and discursive project of manufacturing controversies about established, known scientific facts to advance a political project. And one of the hallmarks of
Mm-hmm.
pseudoscience, and I think this is relevant when we're thinking about Lou, is that there's this reductive mode of thinking, and you've gestured to that a few times here, where
Mm-hmm.
you talk about how she's using broad brushstrokes to define what she is calling the professional managerial class that is not attentive to the fact that universities are filled with all sorts of different kinds of people who do lots of different roles and are engaged in lots of different kinds of inquiry. But the reductive thinking is the same as biological determinism. You have this hormone,
Mm-hmm.
therefore you are a man, and you have this hormone, and therefore you are a woman. This hallmark of this pseudoscience to
Mm-hmm.
again manufacture controversy around something that I'm in Montpellier, France, and this is the home of
Mm-hmm.
the oldest university in France, which is from, I think, the 10th century, maybe the 11th century. So universities, this is just to say that universities have been
Mm-hmm.
around for a really long time. So obviously it's changed a lot, but
Yeah.
we can think of them as something where we know what they are. And so to paint them in these reductive ways is to
Mm-hmm.
just manufacture confusion.
Right. Right. And in some ways, it kind of tries to put up a smokescreen of sorts behind presenting her position as somehow being the one that is really about ideological commitment, which in her case is socialism. And then the kinds of attacks on people on the basis of identity that come with that as part of the package, right? So, one case in point is the kinds of people that Catherine Liu associates herself with or platforms. So, one thing I thought was kind of telling was on her Substack, for instance, right? This is from a few days ago, but like in one of the recent posts, she is restacking or like reposting somebody like Kathleen Lowry, who, as you were just saying regarding these ideas of biological sex and, identity, like, I mean, to put it bluntly, like she's a turf who basically, like Catherine Liu, is essentially a transphobe who is talking about the importance of, protecting women, recognizing women as women and, women's rights and all of these things. Not very different from somebody like J.K. Rowling
Or
and all these
Donald
groups of
Trump.
people who, again, or
Yeah.
Donald Trump, right? So it's kind of like who do you really want to be in
Yeah.
camp with, right? As you're taking this kind of position. And I think it's also telling from, in Catherine Liu's words herself, she says when she aligns herself with socialism and claims to take up the mantle of the left, and kind of interesting to think about how she presents herself as being part of like a kind of vanguard who sees things that other people don't. She says socialism itself is neither glamorous nor innovative. And here's the really telling part: it does not sprinkle its agendas with new pronouns or fancy
Wow.
neologisms. Its signifiers, yeah, this is in the conclusion to her book. Its signifiers do not float on air or ether. Its policies should be tethered to good statistics, objective reality, and the power and uncertainty of scientific method and reason.
Wow.
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
really great intellectual work there. Like,
Yeah.
and again, all at the same time, claiming to distance herself from certain intellectuals,
Also,
but then using this
can we
kind of
time out?
language.
Like, this person is a film studies scholar, like, and is saying that we need to be spending more
Yeah,
time in the
yeah,
natural sciences? Like, what? That
right.
seems very strange. That would be like me as
Tesla?
a political scientist, what would that be like? I mean, I guess that would be like, I think that we should elect our next official using poetry. Like, it doesn't it it feels like a
Yeah.
very epistemological mismatch, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. 100%. I think it's very revealing that and indicative of a lot of people who are, again, very prominent, getting a lot of views, a
Hmm.
lot of clicks, a lot of followers, who use in different ways their associations with intellectuals and with intellectual life and positions within academies, which again, as we talked about, that's where Catherine Liu is at herself, right? So presenting herself as a university professor, as an expert in, again, film studies and culture and so on, but that this somehow is supposed to give her an expertise on all of these different
Hmm.
matters to the point where it also allows her to claim to speak for socialists and for socialism and for people on the
Yeah.
left. One other case in point, which I think really exposes the shallowness behind the kinds of critiques and the really, I think, shoddy intellectual work that she does in talking about things like her critiques of trauma and suffering. One of the things she does is to take aim at the notion of lived experience, right? And I think we should kind of dive into this a little bit because in one of the videos that, again, has gotten a lot of views, and I think she's repeated this point several times, is that this idea of lived experience is like this sort of invented notion that people on the basis of identity use to kind of create a sort of form of empathy from people based on this what she thinks is a kind of like fake
Hmm.
suffering or trauma. And in one of the videos where she is being asked about what lived experience actually is and where it comes from, this again I think really exposes the shallowness in her critique. One of the interviewers asked her, should we blame this idea of lived experience on somebody like
Mm.
Levinas? So, Emmanuel Levinas, he engaged with this idea, of course. And then Catherine Liu gives this kind of long winded, but actually like very misguided kind of characterization of lived experience and its association with Levinas, but really misses the point on a lot of things, right? If we really think about what lived experience is or where that term even comes from, this has been around for a very long time in phenomenology and again is used by a lot of philosophers, but then it kind of found its way into just, ordinary, like just common discourse about the ways that we actually experience reality, especially on the basis of our identities and our very sort of like flesh and blood sort of existence in the world, right? First of all, this is something that somebody like Liu does not acknowledge or doesn't seem to know about. This traces back all the way to the earliest phenomenologists. Like it goes all the way back to Husserl, who's kind of like the sort of OG phenomenologist that everybody ends up drawing from. And originally in the German, there's this idea of Erlebnis, or what is lived, like how, again, how you experience reality with the
Hmm.
being that you have in the world. Then it gets picked up by people like Merleau-Ponty, who talk about it, and then this is how it finds its way into English, gets translated into French, and you'll probably be able to say this better than I can, but it's the notion of the expérience
Mm.
vécue, right? So like the actual experience that you have again, like live. It
Hmm.
approaches the same meaning that we give to it in English. But I think where it really started to get picked up and again attached to the notion of identity and its actual political significance is in Frantz
Hmm.
Fanon. Because Fanon, of course, talks about this in Black Skin, White Mass and directly uses that idea in the original French that he drew from Merleau-Ponty. So he's got one of his most, best known chapters in Black Skin, White Mass is the lived experience of the
Hmm.
black man, right? And a lot of people, I think, who read that text or knew about it kind of indirectly have since then used this term to talk about, as Fanon did, what it actually feels like to walk around in the body and the skin and the identity that you
Hmm.
have. And of course, Fanon talks about it in terms of the forms of dehumanization that he experienced on the
Mm-hmm.
daily, right? Being called the N word as he is walking around in Martinique or later in his experiences in France and elsewhere. The actual forms of
Mm-hmm.
humiliation and the very real forms of suffering that people actually experience on the basis of their
Mm-hmm.
identity. So, like, these are very real things. And I think there's a good reason why a lot of people picked up
Mm-hmm.
on this and continue to use this kind of language, right? But in short, I think that somebody like Catherine Liu, one, doesn't acknowledge that actual like history and the ways in which these terms have kind of
Mm-hmm.
originated and how they've proliferated over time and why they actually mean so much to people because like in reality identity exists as a
Mm-hmm.
it's not just like like
Mm-hmm.
invented in some way, or it's not something that people just use to like leverage their
Mm-hmm.
position. It's something that people feel in a very real way,
Yeah, and I think,
right?
I
So,
really appreciate the time that you spent describing Fanon's use of lived experience to build this analysis of what I view as power. Because at the end of the day,
mhm,
one does not need to identify as any particular group. But what will happen is that you will be identified as part of that group. And that, in and of itself, is an
right,
exercise of power. So to say that identity
mhm,
is second to class or that identity shouldn't matter is to evacuate analysis of power, in my view. And I can't think of
right,
anything more damaging in this political moment than to pretend as if we're all on some sort of mythical level playing field when the reality, when you look around, suggests otherwise. And so I think, again, going back to this
right,
point about pseudoscience, it's this reductive mode of thinking that's very
mhm,
seductive. It's very sexy on the internet, but isn't really
mhm,
offering a robust analysis of what's happening in our social world or about
right,
really important categories like identity.
right. And why identity actually matters to
Mm-hmm.
people, like you said. And I think that's exactly right. It is very much a question of power. It's not necessarily chosen in a sense, right? It's something that, I mean, first of all, the identity that one has, so let's say in relation to race, it of course doesn't exist in a vacuum or it doesn't just come about by itself, but it exists in relation to
Mm-hmm.
whiteness, right? And so, of course, if we look at the whole sort of history of racial formation and the categories and the hierarchies that existed within that, going all the way back to like Nicholas Linnaeus and like this whole sort of categorization of people on the basis of race, it always operated in that way in which, white European people were placed at the very
Mm-hmm.
top and were given certain characteristics, and everybody else existed like the categories that, Linnaeus and then many others, including Kant and others, then drew on. Again, they're within
Mm-hmm.
those within that hierarchy, right? So like, black people, so-called yellow races or
Mm-hmm.
Asiatics, as they were described, or people like indigenous peoples in the Americas. It was, of course, all on the basis of like color. But then there's like these essential characteristics that were ascribed to them. So it's like those identities are what a lot of people are now living
Mm-hmm.
with today, right? And of course, uh, we know that in race thinking and going back to its origins, and again actual processes of racialization, it is a pseudoscience from
Mm-hmm.
its origins, but it comes to have a social
Mm-hmm.
reality, and it comes to have a bearing on the way that people live their lives and experience reality.
Absolutely. And if one claims to be on the left and offering political analysis that says that identity
Mhm.
is a waste of time, the downstream effect of that is to say that the terms on which you might seek out political activity are actually false. Because this is the other thing, and I think, I
Mhm.
wanted to make this point earlier that you might not identify with a certain racial, sexual, class, ability, all the categories, but at a certain point in time, that category might be made salient to you. So we could use the example of 9/11 in
Mhm.
the United States.
Mhm.
And suddenly people who are Arab American understand themselves as possibly within the category of terrorist, right? That's what makes the category of
Hmm.
Arab meaningful, and also a point for to mobilize is this idea that you are
Hmm.
being lumped into this group. And so what does it mean to mobilize then? Is that so? Again, if you're on the left and you're saying that identity is
Right.
a form of false consciousness, what you're actually doing is you
Mm.
are dismissing one of the main ways that people become politically aware, become politically
Mm.
active, understand their position within the world. And that is a really damaging and, I
Yeah.
think, far right project.
Hmm. Yeah. And I know that this is something that, you've highlighted in your work, and I want to ask you about the notion of how these things are intersectional and how they should be understood in such a way, right? Because again, as we've been saying, for people like Catherine Liu, they're somehow supposed to be like mutually
I
exclusive, right?
know.
So like you either take up one struggle or another. So it should just be like class struggle at the expense of everything else.
Yeah.
But it's like that's simplifying things so
Mm-hmm.
much, right? Not to mention that, as you just said, like there's the example of 9/11 and the sort of reverberations of that over the past few decades, but it's also very much a part of the
Mm-hmm.
present, right? Just this past week, if you look at what happened with the attacks
Mm.
on Muslim people,
Mm-hmm.
this
San
essentially,
Diego. Yeah.
yeah, this, what if the shoe was on the other foot, they'd be calling it an act of terror,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like essentially it is terrorizing people on the basis of their
Yeah.
religion, on their identity. These are things that we continue to see, and that can somehow just like be glossed over
Mm-hmm.
in some way by people who claim that like our real struggle should be class
Mm-hmm.
and socialism and so on. Not to mention the continuing racial terror that Black people experience in this
Mm-hmm.
country. Like one really disturbing thing that I saw this past week, but I think it's been going on for a while, is that you had this guy named, and I think there are a lot of people who have been sort of following him and like kind of trying to be like, copycat, sort of just like imitating the things that he does. But I think his name is like Chud the Builder or something like this. I don't know if I'm getting the name right or not, but it's just something stupid and fucking
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous. But it's like this racist asshole who intentionally has gone around calling Black people the N-word, and then like on his socials and whatever, and like to his group of followers, he's like, this is we need to do this kind of like, to provoke them and whatever, and then just to see how they respond, and then bringing weapons with him so that when they do respond and when they do call him out, and when things, as they do tend to
Mm-hmm.
escalate when you make that kind of provocation, then doing things like pepper spraying them or actually drawing a gun. And what happened recently is that he provoked someone to the point where there was a kind of altercation and he shot and killed this person, and then has recently been facing actual, getting like a conviction for it. But the really disturbing thing is that to his followers, this is something to
Mm-hmm.
emulate,
Yeah.
right? And that he can actually get criminally prosecuted, as he should, for again what is essentially a form of terror. But it's like this way of trying to normalize that or to
Yeah.
spread that kind of thinking, which of course, as we've discussed before, is nothing new
Mm-hmm.
in these United States, but is still very present and very
Mm-hmm.
disturbing, I
Yeah.
think, right? And all of that again is on the basis of race
Mm-hmm.
and identity.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, my thing when it's interesting that we're focusing on Lou so much, who is advancing this line, which to my memory has a very long lineage. I could sit here and rattle off a lot of academics who identify themselves as socialists or Marxists and take serious issue with either ways that have been or ways of theorizing identity or intersectionality in particular. And I always
Mm-hmm.
find
Mm-hmm.
this so strange because if you've spent any time reading Black feminist theory and understanding or trying to understand intersectionality and its critiques, right? So thinking about like Poir's terrorist assemblages and things like this, who are arguing that like actually like intersectionality is insufficient in these different ways, and if what if we used a different spatial metaphor, and I think all of those conversations are so valuable. No one in those conversations is saying we only care about race and not class. And
Yeah.
there's this political scientist named Anne Marie Hancock who has what she argues is an intellectual history of intersectionality, and she's really trying to pull it away from some of the ways that it has been appropriated by people who don't really understand it and locate it again in this tradition of Black feminist thinking. And so we can go back really early to thinking about the ways that people who we now would identify as Black feminist thinkers were talking simultaneously about gender, race, and class. Always, 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 always. And so I think it's such a strange thing that I see happening all the time. Adolph Reed at Penn does this. He's the one who I always think of as doing this, and there are others for sure that I could name, but I don't know. I don't know why. I don't understand the whole divide and conquer because, again, from my perspective, having read a lot of these foundational texts in intersectionality, no one is not saying that class doesn't matter. And in fact, we can understand class as, I mean, think about Angela Davis, for example, as in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways, the condition upon which these categories gain meaning. So to argue that there is this lack of sufficient attention to class is just mind-boggling to me because the
Right.
inverse is true. If you are only looking at class, as you've pointed out so clearly, it is really flattening at the end of the day. It has to be more
Mm-hmm.
nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
Even class itself is not one thing. We know this, right? I actually, and this is something that I was interested in. I was wondering if you were thinking about this at all with her introduction of the PMC and to what extent that is different from like the petite bourgeoisie. Are we supposed to understand that as different?
Mm.
Is this her just like trying to like brand a new thing? That was one question that popped
Yeah.
into my head in terms of thinking about.
Yeah, it seems to me from, looking at her book that part of her claim is that there has been this kind of transformation over time that has somehow continually, according to her view, put people in the so-called PMC in like higher positions of power, right? So in that like that brief excerpt that I read before, like it's essentially like, in a sense like the petite bourgeoisie, but also sort of rising even
Mm,
above that, being kind of like a new kind of leisure class, right? Again, in the kinds of activities that she
mm,
describes, right? Reading
mm-hmm,
books, having sex, staying healthy, da da
mm-hmm.
da. Like as if somehow everybody within that category necessarily has, is able to do all of those things, or is just like, living so well and
Mm-hmm.
like has like no difficulties in
Yeah.
life. Whereas again, if you look at the reality and like the power imbalances that exist and like who actually has real wealth and
Mm-hmm.
power in the
Yeah.
West, right? So like, North American and European institutions, it's not university professors, it's not people who are, and especially people who are, for example, adjuncts or like
Mm-hmm.
non-tenured
Yeah.
faculty and so on, who struggle basically right to get by while it, but if we're talking about like administrators and people who have real wealth and power, again, there's no comparison there, right? But so this idea of like lumping everybody in together and somehow claiming that they're all collectively part of like this bourgeoisie is again very misleading. It might, yeah, again, because of the comparisons that she makes to how things were like, from the 60s
Mm-hmm.
onward. Sure, if we go back to a certain time, but this is kind of the case for a lot of people, right? For example, being able to afford a home and like,
Mm-hmm.
to actually buy a house and have like all of these comforts. Like, yeah, maybe in previous decades, these were things that people, maybe a lot of people in academia had access to. But it's like anybody who knows about the struggles that people face
Mm-hmm.
today and at this stage of capitalism, that is not the
Mm-hmm.
reality. So, in a lot of ways, I think she's just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
describing this kind of like vision of times past and then kind of like stamping that somehow onto the
Hmm.
present. But again, is very, I think, is
Yeah, I
mischaracterizing
mean,
things
the only
by
way
a
that I
long way.
see this analysis working is if you say that the PMC are university administrators and that the university
Hmm.
professors and the adjuncts, tenure track, everyone are the working class. In that case, I can kind
Yeah.
of see this playing out. I don't think that's what she's doing, but
Mm-mm.
I would be more open to buying this argument if she were doing more of that fine-grained analysis. For example,
Yeah.
I recently learned that a high-ranking university administrator at a college that will go unnamed has received in 1 year retirement contributions that total the retirement contributions of approximately 10 years
Hmm.
at Fordham for me. And I
Mm.
was thinking,
Mm.
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But I think it
Hmm.
it points to the discrepancies within the PMC, and to just label university
Yeah.
professors as part of this, or intellectuals, writers, and things like this is really out of touch with the reality of what most people
Right.
who are like me and you, I'm tenured, you're non-tenured.
Mm.
Neither of us is a Rockefeller. I think the best thing we've got is social capital. Like, that's just the reality.
Yeah.
No.
Right. Right. Comparing that to people who are getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in
Yeah.
bonuses and housing allowances and things like this, like, yeah, those are
Yeah.
administrators. Like for our listeners who don't know this, like that is not what professors
Yeah.
get.
Definitely. And
So,
we're on 9-month
um,
contracts too. So we're
yeah,
only working 9 months of the year. Like, we
right.
are only getting paid for 9 months of labor. So, yeah.
Exactly. And maybe as a final point, I think to kind of really zoom out and think about what this means for discourses that I think are again proliferating today and why they need to be challenged. Maybe we can end with talking about the whole notion of the whole intellectual
Mm.
vocation and what it's actually really about, right? Like, so for those of us who get into academia, why do we actually do this, right?
Because
Is
we
it
hate ourselves.
according
We
to
hate
people like,
money. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, in part, right? Yeah, but because according to Liu and others, it's that like we just want like to feel superior to others and to have this kind of all of these comforts and
Hmm.
material comforts and da da da, and then to have this like resentment toward what she calls the lower classes, etc. Um, but it's like what are we actually
Yeah.
doing? Like, how would you describe it, Zane? Like,
Yeah.
what is our intellectual vocation other than as you said, hating
Yeah.
ourselves, putting ourselves to this?
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak for all academics, obviously, but I do think that the people who I try to keep company with are academics who are working really hard to bridge that perceived gap between academia and people and their real lives. And I think that, in fact, you can't have one without the other. There's no social science without trying to understand what people's realities are and the things that they're struggling with and the ways that they understand power and the ways that power affects them. And then I think the responsibility as a researcher and as an intellectual is to examine those things and get analytic traction on them, and then repackage them in ways that doesn't tell people what to think, but instead offers
Hmm.
opportunities, tools for people to analyze the things that are happening in their lives. And I
Hmm.
think that that
Yeah.
is a tall order, but to my mind, that is what we are doing. And I actually think, I joke a lot about money, and I think, like, that's actually the trade-off. Like, I don't think you can do
Hmm.
that if you are getting a lot of money. Like, I think that it's supposed to
Hmm.
be a solid middle class vocation, so that you can have enough time and energy and space to do that
Hmm.
project. In my view, again, I don't
Yeah.
think that that's what everybody is doing, but that would be my hope. I mean, that's what teaching is at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that puts it so well. If we think about, who our kinds of, intellectual, say, predecessors or people that, some of us really look up to and take inspiration from, I think a lot of them, and this is, to connect it to the kinds of things that we discussed previously with James Baldwin and Malcolm X and others, I think a lot of the inspiration that people draw is through the exactly kinds of the kinds of connections that you just alluded to, which is being into the tapped in to the real struggles that people face outside of, say, the academy and so on, right? I think where we actually draw a lot of our, just even our language and our commitments from, is by being attentive to the struggles that people actually have. And again, if you want to call them more broadly, like the working class, but it's also just like people who are in positions in which power is being used against them, where there are these asymmetric power relations, the ways that they actually articulate their experiences of that. I think in many ways, for people, if you want to broadly describe them as intellectuals or people within academia, I think a lot of us get our commitments from that, right? So it's actually deeply relational. It's not this sort of like top-down
Yeah.
thing and this whole stupid idea that like we're in these ivory towers and, like you said, that we're somehow like telling people what to think and so on. But essentially trying to articulate what those experiences are like and then what might be done about them if we use these kinds of critical capacities to really critique and to point out forms of exclusion and domination and so on wherever we see them, and then to try to put forward possible solutions toward that. Again, ultimately in this kind of intersectional way that is not just thinking about it in terms of identity, but also in terms of class and all of these related
And I would
struggles,
say, not even thinking about
right?
it in terms of identity and class as these, like, either they're mutually exclusive or not, but also thinking less about identity and class and thinking more about power and ideologies. So when I teach students
Yeah.
intersectionality, I say this actually is, I mean, identity is one way that we can understand what's happening, but what really is happening is the exercise of power on certain groups vis-a-vis
Yes.
dominant ideologies. So white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, classism, Christian normativity, all of these different factors that come to bear on people at different points
Right.
in their lives, in different circumstances, depending on where they find themselves in relation to those dominant ideologies. So again, to my mind, it's not an either or, and it's not even, we need to be so excited about identity so much as we need to be really thinking critically about power at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
academics can do so much valuable work on that. I would love to see someone, and I'm thinking about what, someone like Catherine Liu would say about this, but the growing awareness around deed theft in New York City. So basically, this practice of targeting what are usually black homeowners with intimidation to evacuate their homes and steal the deeds
Yeah.
of their homes so that developments
Yeah.
can be put in their place or it can be flipped and sold. I mean, to me this is just astounding. It's not, I mean, in some ways
Yeah.
we know where the framework was established for this. I mean, it's through the dispossession of native people of their lands and Palestinians in, occupied Palestine, and also now is knocking on the doors of people in Brooklyn and in the Bronx. And so I think, academics could have so much to say about that, but we're not going to get anywhere if where we're getting our social media traction is by just calling the other camp dumb. But that's beside the point. We need to be
Yeah.
focusing on things like this that
Yeah.
actually are about the imbrication of race and class and gender. I think a lot of times these people are women whose homes are being stolen from them, so.
Right. Right. And so maybe to put it all sort of concisely at the end in terms of why we thought it was important to have this kind of critique, I think, to put it really bluntly, I think that people like Catherine Liu are ultimately misleading a lot of their followers and listeners and people through these ways of getting traction, again, on social media, on YouTube, on these really easy to consume kinds of videos. They portray things, again, often in this very black and white kind of way in which these ideas are supposed to be mutually exclusive, or like people's commitments are supposed to be mutually exclusive. But I think it's important to really continue to sound the alarm bells about the increasing prevalence of this kind of discourse, right? And ultimately continue to invite people who engage with, the kinds of discussions that you and I are having, as well as with our guests, but also, as a kind of community of people who are in conversation with each other, to really think deeply and critically about this, right? And to call it out for what it is. And so to that end, I think, as we always want to do, because the whole idea behind this whole thing that you and I are doing was to, of course, as we talked about from the beginning, to take these ways of thinking outside of the walls of the classroom, and to have these sort of broader engagements with people through these different forms of media. And so, really, I think inviting our audience to also continue to be in conversation, to weigh in with their thoughts. And so even though we focused pretty much exclusively on somebody like Catherine Liu in this particular episode, the sort of broader currents of anti-intellectualism that we're seeing, and kind of having a larger discussion about that, right? And so for our listeners, it would be great to get their thoughts.
Yeah, and
as
I'm
well.
actually gonna be even. I'm putting, like, I'm getting into professor mode, because what I think would be really interesting too is if people have examples of either influencers who position themselves as progressives but are actually contributing to far-right and fascistic ways of thinking, and I can think of a couple of examples off the top of my head, or just examples that we're seeing all over in politics right now of anti-intellectualism, for example, the FDA, where there's been this real, and the Trump administration has fostered an anti-intellectual ethos, and I don't think that that's new. I think that it has happened very quickly under this administration, but I'd be curious to hear people's examples that they have of places where they see this in their daily lives, because I always think it's so interesting. I mean, there's the ones that I can think of and you can think of, but if we have, even 5 more that we never thought of, it'd be so useful. And I think it could be one thing that I want to put on our agenda maybe moving forward is thinking, like, when we say that this is far right adjacent, what do we mean when we say that? And I think it would be really interesting for us, and maybe we could think of a guest that we could bring on who would help us to think about those characteristics so that it could be like a toolkit for people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great prompt, I think. So, one for our listeners, if people come to mind
Yeah.
that you have your thoughts on, please do share in the comments, as well as like potential guests or others that we might also engage with. Because I think, exactly, for the reasons that you just said, Zane, really important to extend these conversations. So we'll hope to do that increasingly in our upcoming episodes.
Sounds great. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end this. Thanks, all of you, for tuning in. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at exilic_city, and to drop some comments either there or in Apple Podcasts, and let us know what you're thinking.
That's right. Thank you all. See you for the next one.